Human teeth ripped into the raw flesh of the deer-like alien creature, blood dripping down Joshua's chin as the Hazari looked on in abject horror, finally realizing the terrible truth. Humans were predators who killed and consumed other living beings. It was a moment that would forever change the course of Hazari-human relations, Professor Sirius said gravely, his long ears twitching as he addressed the wide-eyed students. When Captain Zari and her landing party first encountered the human colonists on EOS 17, they had no idea of the shocking revelation that awaited them. The students leaned forward, eager to hear more about this pivotal event. Sirius explained how the Hazari, a peaceful herbivorous race, had long dreamed of making contact with other sentient species. So when their exploration vessel, the HS Harmony, detected signs of human life on a remote planet, they were overjoyed at the opportunity to meet a new civilization. But as the Hazari shuttle touched down near the small Exogene corporate colony, they were completely unprepared for the gruesome sight that greeted them. Joshua Mitchell, the human leader, and his fellow colonists were in the midst of butchering a freshly killed animal, its blood staining the ground a vivid crimson. Zari and her team watched in mute horror as the humans skinned and gutted the creature with practiced efficiency, laughing and joking as they worked. The Hazari, who had evolved from prey animals, felt a primal terror grip their hearts as they witnessed the shocking brutality of these alien predators. For the Hazari, this moment represented a shattering of their long-held beliefs about the universe and their place in it. If they couldn't find a way to coexist with these terrifying meat-eaters, their dreams of peaceful interstellar cooperation would be dashed forever. The fate of their two species hung in the balance, and everything depended on what happened next. Professor Sirius cleared his throat. Captain Zari and her team, visibly shaken by what they had witnessed, stumbled back to their shuttle in a daze. They couldn't get the image of those blood-soaked humans out of their minds. Zari slammed her hoof on the shuttle controls to close the door and ordered an immediate return to the HES Harmony. The students shuddered, imagining the Hazari's horror at encountering such terrifying alien predators. Sirius nodded gravely and continued. Once safely back on their ship, Zari rushed to report her shocking findings to the Hazari High Council. She described in vivid detail the gruesome scene they had stumbled upon, the humans ripping into the flesh of their prey, the blood dripping from their mouths, the primal savagery in their eyes. Meanwhile, back at the Exogene colony, Joshua Mitchell noticed the Hazari's abrupt departure. He frowned, worried that there had been some misunderstanding. The last thing he wanted was for these peaceful aliens to think humans were monsters. Sirius leaned forward. Joshua made a fateful decision. He sent a message to the Hazari ship inviting Captain Zari and her crew to a diplomatic dinner. He hoped they could discuss their cultural differences and establish a friendly relationship. Little did he know this dinner would go down in history. The students murmured excitedly. They had all heard of the infamous Feast of Flesh incident, but none knew the full story. When the Hazari received Joshua's invitation, they were hesitant to accept. They were still reeling from the shock of discovering that humans were predators. The idea of sitting down to a meal with these meat-eaters was deeply unsettling. Sirius's ears twitched. But Captain Zari knew she had a duty to maintain peace with this newly encountered species, no matter how strange and terrifying they might be. She decided to accept the invitation, bringing along her trusted first officer, Thalor, and the ship's medical officer, Liana. The professor paused dramatically. As the Hazari delegation prepared to beam down to the Exogene colony once more, they had no idea that they were about to participate in one of the most infamous diplomatic incidents in Hazari history, an event that would forever be seared into our cultural memory as the Feast of Flesh. The Hazari delegation arrived at the Exogene colony's main building, apprehensive but determined to maintain diplomatic relations. Joshua Mitchell, the human leader, greeted them at the entrance, flanked by his second-in-command, Eric Rodriguez, and the colony's chef, Marcus Thompson. The humans extended their hands in welcome, warm smiles plastered across their faces. Captain Zari and her crew, Thalor and Liana, awkwardly returned the gesture, forcing their own smiles as they tried to conceal their lingering unease. The cultural differences were already apparent, as physical contact was uncommon among the Hazari. As Joshua led the group into the dining area, the Hazari froze in their tracks, struck by the sight before them. A large rectangular table dominated the room, adorned with an array of dishes, each containing various types of meat. Professor Sirius, his voice growing somber, described the scene in vivid detail to his students. Sizzling steaks, their juices pooling on the plates, sat alongside roasted poultry, the skin crisp and golden. The centerpiece, a whole suckling pig, its flesh glistening under the light, seemed to stare at the Hazari with lifeless eyes. The Hazari delegation, their stomachs churning at the sight and smell of the cooked flesh, struggled to maintain their composure as they took their seats at the table. Thalor, his snout twitching, leaned over to Zari and whispered, "Captain, I don't know if I can do this. The smell alone is making me nauseous." Zari, her own face pale, replied through gritted teeth, "We have to, Thalor, for the sake of our people and the future of our relations with these humans." Joshua, seemingly oblivious to the Hazari's discomfort, proudly announced, "We've prepared a special meal for you today, showcasing the diverse range of animals found on EOS 17 and the culinary skills of our colonists. Please, enjoy." The Hazari, meanwhile, could barely touch their plates, their appetites completely suppressed by the gruesome spectacle before them. Liana, the medical officer, discreetly scanned the food with her tricorder, her eyes widening at the results. She leaned over to Zari and whispered urgently, "Captain, the meat, it's from sentient species. I'm detecting traces of genetic material from the creatures we saw earlier." Zari's eyes widened in horror, her stomach threatening to rebel. She glanced at Thalor, who looked equally sickened by the revelation. The Hazari delegation exchanged tense looks, realizing that they were not only dining with predators, but with beings who consumed sentient life forms. Professor Sirius's voice grew solemn as he recounted the turning point of that fateful evening. Marcus Thompson, the colony's chef, decided to showcase human culinary skills in a way that would forever change the course of Hazari-human relations. He brought out a live creature native to EOS 17, a small rabbit-like animal the colonists called a hopper. The students leaned forward, their eyes wide with morbid fascination as Sirius described the scene. Joshua Mitchell, the human leader, took the hopper and placed it on the table in front of him. The Hazari watched in horror as he picked up a large knife and began to skillfully skin the creature, narrating each step of the process. Sirius's voice dropped to a whisper. As Joshua removed the hopper's organs and separated its meat into different cuts, the Hazari could no longer contain their revulsion. Thalor, unable to control his gag reflex, vomited onto his plate. Liana, the medical officer, fainted, slumping in her chair. The professor paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Captain Zari, her face pale and her hands trembling, stood up abruptly. She demanded to know how humans could engage in such barbaric practices, her voice laced with a mixture of horror and disgust. Sirius shook his head. Joshua, taken aback by the Hazari's extreme reaction, tried to explain that eating meat was a natural and essential part of human biology and culture. He pointed out that many Earth animals, including humans, were omnivores, and that consuming meat had played a crucial role in their evolution and survival. The students murmured among themselves, imagining the tense confrontation between the two species. Sirius continued, but Joshua's words only served to further horrify the Hazari delegation. They could not fathom the idea of a species that not only ate other creatures, but also justified it as a necessary part of their existence. The professor's ears twitched as he recalled the aftermath of the incident. Captain Zari, unable to bear the sight of the butchered hopper any longer, turned on her heel and stormed out of the room. Thalor and Liana, both still reeling from the shock, quickly followed suit. Sirius leaned forward, his voice grave. The Feast of Flesh, as it would come to be known, marked a turning point in Hazari-human relations. The Hazari High Council, upon hearing Zari's report, was outraged and disgusted by the humans' behavior. They immediately cut off all diplomatic ties with the Exogene colony, and declared humans a threat to their way of life. Professor Sirius shook his head gravely as he described the aftermath of the disastrous dinner. Captain Zari and her team stumbled out of the dining area, their faces pale and their stomachs churning. Joshua Mitchell and his crew were left behind, confused and concerned by the Hazari's abrupt departure. Sirius's ears twitched as he continued. Thaler, still fighting back waves of nausea, suggested that the Hazari High Council should immediately sever all ties with the humans. "They're dangerous and unpredictable," he argued, his snout wrinkling in disgust. "We can't trust a species that actively hunts and consumes other life forms." The professor leaned forward, his voice growing more serious. But Captain Zari, ever the level-headed leader, argued that they needed to report their findings to the High Council and allow them to make an informed decision about the future of human-Hazari relations. "We can't let our personal revulsion cloud our judgment," she said, her voice firm despite the lingering horror in her eyes. "The Council must be made aware of what we've discovered." The professor paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The Hazari High Council now faced a momentous decision. They had to weigh the potential benefits of establishing relations with a technologically advanced species against the risks of engaging with a civilization that seemed to embrace such barbaric practices. The fate of the Hazari-human relationship hung in the balance, and the Council knew that their choice would have far-reaching consequences for generations to come. Professor Sirius's voice dropped to a hushed tone as he revealed a shocking twist in the unfolding drama between the Hazari and the humans. "What the Hazari didn't know," he said, his eyes scanning the captivated faces of his students, was that Joshua Mitchell and his team had been monitoring their communications all along. The students gasped, leaning forward in their seats as Sirius continued. Joshua had intercepted Captain Zari's report to the High Council, and he realized the gravity of the situation. If he didn't act fast, the budding relationship between their two species could be shattered beyond repair. Sirius described how Joshua, driven by a sense of urgency, contacted the Exogene headquarters on Earth. He requested an emergency meeting with the company's board of directors, knowing that he needed their support to salvage the situation. In the boardroom, Joshua stood before the directors, his voice steady as he explained the events that had transpired on EOS 17. "The Hazari's reaction, while extreme to us, is understandable given their herbivorous nature," he argued, his hands gesturing emphatically. "They've never encountered a species like ours before, one that consumes other life forms." The directors listened intently as Joshua proposed a bold plan. "We need to send a delegation to the Hazari homeworld," he said, his eyes locking with each board member in turn. "A team of diplomats, xenobiologists, and cultural experts who can meet with the High Council and attempt to bridge the gap between our two cultures." Sirius's ears twitched as he recounted the board's reaction. They recognized the potential for the Hazari to become valuable trade partners and allies, and they agreed to Joshua's plan without hesitation. As the Exogene team assembled, ready to embark on their critical mission, Sirius shifted his focus to the Hazari homeworld. "Meanwhile," he said, his voice growing somber, the High Council was locked in a fierce debate about how to respond to the discovery of human predatory behavior. The students could almost picture the scene. The Hazari councillors, their long ears twitching with agitation as they argued back and forth. Some members called for complete isolation from humanity, Sirius explained, believing that any species that consumed flesh was too dangerous to associate with. But others, he noted, recognized the potential benefits of establishing a relationship with a technologically advanced species like humanity. They advocated for further dialogue and cultural exchange, hoping to find common ground despite their differences. As the debate raged on, Sirius revealed the final twist in the tale. The Hazari were unaware, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, that a human delegation, led by none other than Joshua Mitchell himself, was already on its way to their world. The students sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of this revelation. Sirius leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with the promise of what was to come. Joshua and his team were determined to bridge the cultural divide and forge a path towards peaceful coexistence, no matter the obstacles they might face. The lecture hall buzzed with excitement as the students speculated about the impending encounter between the Hazari High Council and the human delegation. Would Joshua's mission succeed, or would the Hazaris' fear and revulsion towards humanity's predatory nature prove too great to overcome? Sirius, his voice filled with anticipation, left his students with a final thought. The fate of two species hung in the balance, he said, his words echoing in the hushed room, as the human ship hurtled through space, carrying with it the hopes and fears of both the Hazari and the humans. Professor Sirius leaned forward, his voice growing more animated, as he described the human delegation's arrival on the Hazari homeworld. Joshua Mitchell and his team stepped out of their spacecraft onto the alien soil, their hearts pounding with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The students listened intently as Sirius painted a vivid picture of the scene. They were immediately greeted by a heavily armed Hazari security detail led by the imposing commander Qatar. The Hazari soldiers, their sleek weapons at the ready, formed a tight perimeter around the humans. Sirius' ears twitched as he recounted the delegation's journey through the Hazari capital. As they made their way towards the High Council chamber, Joshua couldn't help but notice the crowds of Hazari lining the streets. Many of them had never seen a human before, and they stared at the delegation with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The professor's voice grew somber. But not all the onlookers were merely curious. Some held up placards depicting humans as vicious, bloodthirsty predators. They chanted slogans demanding the expulsion of the meat-eaters from their world. Joshua, Sirius explained, did his best to ignore the hostile signs and focus on the task at hand. He knew that the fate of human-Hazari relations rested on his shoulders. He had to convince the High Council that despite their dietary differences, their two species could find common ground. As the delegation approached the High Council chamber, Sirius described the growing sense of unease among the humans. The tension in the air was palpable. Wary looks and hushed whispers followed them as they walked, the Hazari security detail keeping a watchful eye on their every move. Finally, they reached the chamber doors. Sirius's voice dropped to a whisper. When they entered, they were greeted by an awe-inspiring sight. 12 Hazari elders sat at a semicircular table, each adorned in elaborate robes and headdresses that signified their status and authority. At the center of the table, Sirius revealed, sat the High Counselor himself. Zath, a wizened Hazari with piercing eyes and a stern demeanor, regarded the humans with a calculating gaze. Joshua could feel the weight of his stare, the judgment in his eyes. But Joshua, Sirius emphasized, refused to be intimidated. He stepped forward, his head held high, and began to address the council. He knew that the next few moments could determine the course of history for both their species. The professor paused, letting the gravity of the moment sink in. Joshua took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He knew he had to choose his words carefully to find a way to bridge the vast cultural divide that separated humans and Hazari. Sirius's voice grew strong and clear as he spoke Joshua's opening words. "Esteemed members of the Hazari High Council," Joshua began, his voice echoing in the chamber, "I stand before you today, not as a conqueror or a threat, but as an emissary of peace and understanding." The students leaned forward in their seats, hanging on every word, as Sirius recounted Joshua's impassioned speech. The fate of two species hung in the balance, and the future of human-Hazari relations rested on the outcome of this crucial meeting. As Joshua laid out his case, Professor Sirius noted, the atmosphere in the council chamber began to shift. The anger and disgust that had initially greeted the human delegation slowly gave way to a more thoughtful and contemplative mood. "I understand that our dietary practices may seem abhorrent to you," Joshua said, meeting each council member's eyes in turn, "but I implore you to consider the context in which they developed. On Earth, the consumption of meat has been a part of our species' history for millions of years. He gestured to the stack of documents before him. These studies show that our bodies have evolved to process both plant and animal matter. Our digestive systems, our teeth, our very physiology, all have been shaped by our omnivorous diet. The council members leaned forward, examining the evidence Joshua presented. Sirius described how some, like Karim, began to nod slowly as they absorbed the information. Furthermore, Joshua continued, I want to emphasize that our consumption of meat does not define our moral character. We have developed ethical and sustainable practices to ensure the humane treatment of the animals we rely on for sustenance. He held up a series of images depicting lush green pastures filled with grazing cattle. On many human worlds, we have dedicated vast resources to creating environments where these animals can live healthy, natural lives before they are harvested. Joshua also presented examples of plant-based meat alternatives, explaining how human ingenuity had created ways to enjoy the taste and texture of meat without the need for animal slaughter. As he spoke, Sirius noted, the Hazari Council members began to ask questions, their curiosity piqued by Joshua's explanations. They inquired about the specifics of human digestive physiology, the cultural significance of meat in human societies, and the ethical frameworks that governed human-animal husbandry. Joshua answered each query with patience and respect, his voice calm and measured even in the face of the occasional hostile interjection. Slowly but surely, he seemed to be chipping away at the wall of fear and revulsion that had initially separated the two species. I do not ask for your immediate acceptance or understanding, Joshua said as he began to wrap up his presentation. I only ask that you keep an open mind and that you allow us the opportunity to engage in further dialogue and cultural exchange. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each council member in turn. We may have our differences, but I believe that we also have much to learn from one another. With patience, empathy, and a willingness to communicate, I am confident that we can find common ground and build a foundation for lasting peace and cooperation between our peoples. As Joshua concluded his address, Sirius described the reaction from the Hazari Council. Some members, like Zath, remained guarded and skeptical, their expressions still tinged with distaste. But others, like Karim, seemed more receptive, their postures relaxing and their gazes thoughtful as they considered Joshua's words. The room fell silent for a long moment, the weight of the decision before them hanging heavy in the air. Then, slowly, Karim rose to his feet. I believe, he said, his voice ringing out in the hushed chamber, that we owe it to ourselves and to the future of our species to at least consider the humans' proposal. I move that we adjourn for the day to reflect on what we have learned and reconvene tomorrow to discuss our next steps. There was a murmur of assent from the other council members, and Zath, looking somewhat relieved to have the decision postponed, gavelled the session to a close. As Joshua laid out his proposal for a cultural exchange program, Professor Sirius noted, the atmosphere in the council chamber began to shift. The Hazari elders leaned forward, their long ears twitching with interest as they listened to the human's words. A cultural exchange, Zath mused, her piercing eyes fixed on Joshua. An intriguing proposition. But how can we be sure that our delegates will be safe on your world, given what we now know about your species' predatory nature? Joshua met her gaze steadily. I understand your concerns, High Counselor, but I give you my word, as a representative of the Exogene Corporation and of humanity as a whole, that your delegates will be treated with the utmost respect and care during their time on Earth. Zath nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. And what of your own delegates? What do you hope to gain from their time among us? The council members murmured among themselves, weighing the potential risks and benefits of the proposed exchange. Finally, Karim, Zath's second-in-command, spoke up. I believe the humans' proposal has merit, he said, his voice steady. If we are to have any hope of coexisting peacefully with their kind, we must first seek to understand them, and what better way to do so than through direct, immersive experience? Zath was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant as she considered the weight of the decision before her. At last, she turned to Joshua, her expression solemn. Joshua himself was hit multiple times, his body jerking and convulsing as the bullets ripped into him. He fell to the ground, his vision blurring, and his breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of screams and gunfire filled the air, mingling with the acrid smell of smoke and burning flesh. Chaos erupted in the aftermath of the attack, Sirius recounted somberly. The human delegates who survived were rushed to the nearest medical facility, their wounds severe and life-threatening. Joshua himself was in critical condition, his body riddled with bullet holes and his chances of survival slim. On the Hazari side, Sirius said the news of the attack sent shockwaves through the community. Many were horrified by the actions of the True Guardians, seeing it as a betrayal of everything the Hazari stood for. Others, however, saw it as a necessary step to protect their way of life from the corrupting influence of the humans. Protests and demonstrations broke out across the Hazari homeworld, with angry crowds calling for an end to the exchange program and the expulsion of all humans from Hazari space. The High Council found itself under immense pressure from all sides as they struggled to contain the growing unrest. But the worst was yet to come, Sirius said gravely. A group of human extremists, angered by the attack on their compatriots and seeking revenge, launched a retaliatory strike against the Hazari. They targeted a major agricultural complex, one of the main food production centers on the planet. The bombing was devastating, Sirius said, shaking his head. The complex was almost completely destroyed, along with a significant portion of the Hazari's food supply. Panic and chaos gripped the planet as the Hazari struggled to come to terms with the sudden loss of such a critical resource. The Hazari High Council, realizing that the situation had spiraled out of control, was forced to take drastic action. Under immense pressure from their constituents and facing the very real threat of societal collapse, they voted to terminate all diplomatic relations with humanity and ban any further contact between the two species. Joshua Mitchell and the surviving members of his team were given an ultimatum, Sirius said, his voice heavy with regret. Leave the Hazari homeworld immediately or face imprisonment and trial for the actions of their compatriots. Broken physically and emotionally, Joshua had no choice but to comply. He gathered what was left of his team and boarded a transport ship bound for Earth, his mission a complete failure, and his dreams of peaceful coexistence shattered beyond repair. Sirius paused, letting the weight of the tragedy sink in. For a long moment the lecture hall was completely silent, the students and the professor alike lost in their own thoughts. The human-Hazari exchange became a cautionary tale, a warning of the dangers of misunderstanding and the fragility of interspecies relations, Sirius finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Both sides retreated into isolation, nursing their wounds and reinforcing their prejudices. The Hazari became more insular than ever, focusing on rebuilding their shattered society and shutting out the rest of the galaxy. The humans, meanwhile, continued to explore the stars, but with a newfound wariness and suspicion of the alien species they encountered. The professor's voice took on a note of bitterness as he described the legacy of the failed exchange. The humans who participated in the program became known as the flesh-eaters, a derogatory term that would haunt them and their descendants for generations to come. They were ostracized and shunned, seen as traitors to their own kind, and a reminder of the dangers of reaching out to alien species. Sirius paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. But as tragic as the human-Hazari exchange was, he continued, it also serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of empathy, communication, and cultural understanding in the face of difference and adversity. The professor's gaze swept over the assembled students. It is up to us, the next generation of explorers and diplomats, to learn from the mistakes of the past and to approach future encounters with an open mind and a willingness to listen and learn from those who may be different from ourselves. His eyes glinted with a fierce determination. We must never forget the lessons of the human-Hazari exchange, the lives lost and the dreams shattered. But we must also never lose sight of the potential for growth, understanding, and cooperation that exists between all sentient beings, no matter how different we may seem on the surface. Sirius's voice grew stronger, more impassioned. It is our responsibility, as the inheritors of this galaxy, to build bridges instead of walls, to seek out common ground instead of dwelling on our differences. Only then can we hope to create a future in which all species can coexist in peace and harmony. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.